Hello and welcome to our fifth lecture on future punk. Today we will expand a bit on the idea that we have seen in the lectures on startups and these business tools on a more academic or a more poetic level even, in respect of how time plays a role in envisioning a future. So what we are covering today will be waves and cycles, then the concept of pace layers, so that not everything runs at the same speed, in particular even atemporal, so that the things might actually be completely out of sync with each other, and then look at the long now, at really long-lasting expectations for humanity, but even maybe for the cosmos. We have already hit a bit on the waves, so ever resourceful presentations of Benedict Evans show you the hype cycle underlying economic growth wave, which is a sigmoid wave, an S-shaped curve. So we have an exponential growth until the so-called inflection point, when you really start to earn money with the technology, but on the other hand, you have basically already everyone as a customer, so it gets more and more difficult to get new customers until basically everyone who actually needs your technology uses it. And we see that now, of course, with smartphones. So if you look at the S-curves over the last 50 or so years, you see that is a pretty consistent pattern. So in the 70s, we had the mainframe computers, who became a really big thing with the invention of relational database management systems. So everything becomes a database. People can look up things, insurance companies, banks. So for example, your bank account would no longer be a paper ledger where people would write down, the bank clerk would sit down and write down your account, and if you withdraw money, which could only be in cash at that time, would say, well, now Mr. Blumtritt has withdrawn 100 euros, so his new account balance is 100 euro less than he had before, and so on. So it was literally done on paper. And since that was a total mess, I mean, it really had to be done in a very diligent way. So there was always two ledgers that would be kept simultaneously, so you would know that there is no mistake possible. And that changed in the 70s. So banks first, and insurance companies, and then in the end retail and everyone else would use databases. So that is the mainframe computers that made semiconductors a huge business. And investing into development of semiconductors, of course, led to a huge decline in costs, which made it possible around 1980, so say 1978 to 1982, so these years about when the first companies came out with computers that would no longer be mainframe computers, but sit on your desk. I mean, they were not like laptops, they were desktops. They were pretty big still, but like boxes. Maybe, I mean, if you could imagine a computer the size of a small suitcase or something like that. But you could have it in your office. These computers in the beginning were not really cheap, but they were much, much cheaper than anything that was out before. And there were even companies like Apple who came out with computers directly focusing on the consumer market, on people that would use a computer instead of a typewriter in the future. And that became, of course, a huge market in the 1980s, then with the Windows and the Apple operation systems. And end of the 1980s, many people owned computers, and most businesses would have shifted around 1990. Most businesses would have shifted from the mainframe model, where you would have only a console on your desk and would, with your console, tie into the mainframe computer that would serve you, to a client-server model, where your client sitting on your desk would be actually smart, would be a proper computer that would run its own software. So, and that of course was laying the ground for the next step of development, which was the internet. Because if everyone has a computer, at least in their offices in Europe and the US and maybe in Japan and some other parts of Asia, it was still, I mean, small. I mean, we're speaking about maybe 100 million users at that time in the whole world. But still, I mean, you would sell maybe, I don't know, 10, 20 million computers per year, maybe 30 million or something like that. That is large enough to make it a business that is cheap enough for wealthier people like in Europe or in the US to actually have a computer even at home. And that is laying the ground for the internet that starts basically in 1993 when both HTML and the web browser were available and people would start using networks from home, not only in their offices, and would start connecting the local networks in their offices with each other. And so, I mean, you all know that is now the time that you lived through basically in your lifetime. So the web peaked certainly in the late 1990s, and around 2000 the bubble burst. People saw that it would take much longer to make money on the web than in the euphoria people thought, and so the curve flattened, the trough of disillusionment of the hype cycle hit, and everyone was very sad. And then, of course, development didn't stop. A lot was going on, like in particular the development for electronics in cars and other expensive machinery made it much cheaper to have small sensors and small smart components other than just the calculating components in a laptop or so. And by that the smartphone revolution was kicked off. I mean, the first smartphones showed up in the late 90s, but it actually took off with Android phones, Google issuing their own phone in 2010, for example, and then of course with the iPhone. That was just the killer application that made the exponential growth for the smartphones. And now everyone has one. I mean, it will be very hard. I mean, since there is like 5 billion people on the world using smartphones already, I mean, how many more would you get? So it's no wonder that all business models that rely on selling smartphones kind of flatten. So that is business models that, for example, provide you with mobile data. While there was an enormous growth 10 years ago in mobile internet, I'm thinking of the mobile internet providers here, for example, Etisalat or Du, becoming really big multi-billion dollar conglomerations. That is of course no longer the case. Now people choose, and there is a lot of price pressure, and so the smartphone curve flattens again. And now comes the interesting questions. If you look at the years, so we see that there is somehow like a 14-year pattern. So it's basically half a generation of the inflection points. So if you say the 70, 84, 98, 2012, the next inflection point then would be 2026. What might that be? So let's look what is announced for 2026. So for example, just a few weeks ago, I think, Norway announced that in 2025, on 31st of December 2025, they will ban all sale of new combustion engine motors. I mean, that is something. And California, although they are not as radical as Norway, has announced a similar timeline. So in California, people will only be allowed to buy electric vehicles. That doesn't mean that every vehicle be immediately electric, of course. I mean, the cars that are on the road already will not be taken out, but that will certainly push a lot towards going full electric. And car companies like Volkswagen or General Motors have announced that in the 2030s they will stop producing combustion engines completely. So this is probably something that might indicate what the next inflection point, the next S-curve might be, that might turning fossil energy into electric energy. And if you look at the oil prices, so we have crude oil, I think as an average price of $40 in 2020 per barrel. That is like a third of what it was 5 years ago. So crude oil was much more expensive like a decade ago. I mean, really expensive, and people were really panicking. Oh, there will be peak oil, and oil will be so scarce, and we will not be able to afford it anymore. Something totally different happens now. The International Energy Commission, for example, thinks that by 2025 oil will never get expensive anymore. So it's over. And also that by 2030, so the International Energy Agency, which is a United Nations agency, expect that the sale of electric vehicles will have been grown 20-fold, and the supply of energy for these cars will have grown 100-fold. So that's something, and I mean, these people are rather conservative usually. They are not totally euphoric in their expectations. So that is 2026. Something else happens. So if we think of Moore's law, we talked of that semiconductors get smaller and smaller, and basically the efficiency of the calculating components of electronics double every 18 months. That means that you can just extrapolate. At some point, we will reach the size of single atoms for the circuitry. And of course, that doesn't work anymore, because the quantum mechanical effects at that scale will totally outweigh any electric effects. So the prediction is that by 2026, Moore's law will stop, and we will no longer see an increase in efficiency of electronic components, regarding their calculating power. What does that mean? I mean, that doesn't mean that computers stop working. It just means that the computers don't get any more efficient in their basic functionality. So we will see an end of the growth of computers like laptops or whatever. I mean, the big computer clusters and supercomputers, I mean, that is a totally different thing, because they work not by the power of their CPUs, but of the cluster of CPUs and parallel computing. So that is a different discussion that might, of course, get an enormous push by that, because something will happen, since you can't grow the features of your CPUs anymore. What will happen is that they will dramatically decrease in price. So competition gets more and more hard, and companies who made a huge amount of money, like Intel, will find it very hard to get the price premium out of their high-end chips that are so high performing. Instead, we will see a huge increase in semiconductor production that pushes out really cheap CPUs. So that will be an interesting development, because that means that you can have basically a computer everywhere. In a way, that is like a Raspberry Pi or an Arduino. These computers are already very cheap. I mean, the Raspberry Pi is like, what, $15 or so, and is basically a functioning computer. But we will see a Raspberry Pi at the power of an Apple workstation. Because why not? And with that also, ASICs, that means application-specific integrated circuits, specific semiconductor circuits that are custom-made for tasks, will also become much cheaper. like GPUs, for example, the graphic processors in the computers, which are now still very expensive. They will not stay expensive. They will completely drop in price. So this is something that we will expect. And everywhere will be chips. Every brick in a house will have their small computer in it, because why not? The circuitry will be printable. I mean, the technology of printing circuitry is developed. So with the decrease in price and the mass production of cheap circuitry, this technology will finally break through, and we will have basically wallpaper and everything that is printed smart. So this is another thing that will happen in 2026. I think this is a fair assumption. I mean, if not a black swan hits us, there is hardly any way to escape that. So we can actually expect these two things, the electric breakthrough and end of the combustion engine on the one hand, and the end of Moore's law with massive price decrease in computation power. So, and then there's a few other anecdotes that are more like soft predictions. So, for example, Kazakhstan. So, Kazakhstan has started the transition from the Cyrillic alphabet to the Latin alphabet in wake of their modernization. And the plan is that by 2026, this transition will be over and Kazakhstan will be fully in the Latin alphabet. Thinking of Turkey that went through that in the 1920s, moving from Arabic to Latin alphabet, that is a huge step in overcoming their heritage of being part of the Soviet Union. The European Space Agency has announced that by 2026 they will start having a permanent settlement on the moon, and will probably start mining minerals on the moon, not to be transported back to Earth, but to be used on site. So some of the minerals on the moon contain huge amounts of water, for example, and oxygen. So it will be very easy with the lot of sun that the moon also gets to split these minerals into the things that people actually need to survive on the moon's surface. And otherwise, the moon is very rich in other minerals, like, for example, in thorium. Thorium is a radioactive element which you can use for nuclear energy production. And since there is no fear of an ecological catastrophe on the moon, because nothing lives there anyway and it doesn't have an atmosphere where fallout would spread, there's actually not much to say against the use of nuclear energy, other than on Earth. And with these components, international space, intersolar space travel can actually take off, because if you start having this settlement on the moon, as we have seen in the first video, these nice designs for that. Then you can assemble spaceships there, and with a much lower gravity on the moon, it is much, much easier, of course, to launch big vessels and start asteroid mining. And asteroids, of course, that is then the cornucopia with all the precious metals, all the iron and everything that is in abundance in space. And finally, which tells you also about the very long running cycles of some processes, Pope Francis has announced that together with the Patriarch of the Greek Orthodox Church, they will invite the bishops of both denominations to the third ecumenical concile in Nicaea, which is today Iznik in Turkey. So 1700 years ago, in 326 of the Common Era, the Great Concile of Nicaea kind of kicked off what the Catholic Church is today. And so it is really remarkable to think of now going back to the same spot with the two parts of the big two chunks of the church, the Catholic and the Orthodox Church, and uniting them into an ecumenical concile. So this is something that might happen in 2026 as well. So these are just some ideas to show you what we will have to expect in 5 years from now. And let's just see, that's not a very long time. So I think it is it's very humble to look at these small waves. I mean, generally, there is a lot of thinking going on in waves since people started to do more thorough economical analysis. So in the 1900 to 1930s, economies started to think of data, of economic data, in a mathematical way. And that is called macroeconomics, which means that you don't explain things by how single people act, but you think of the whole economic system as being something that you predict in a statistical way. The statistics at that time didn't exist really. I mean, there was hardly any statistical tools in place yet, so the people working on that problem basically developed what we know today as statistics at that time. It was not only in Europe and the US, but also heavily done in India. India had a long-running tradition in demographics. So the rulers in India for 400 or so years used advanced mathematics to predict population dynamics. And so there is a lot of Indian mathematicians contributing to that as well. So it's kind of the first, I think, first mathematical branch that is where there is an acknowledgement of non-Western contribution. So that's the macroeconomics that happened in the 1900s to 1930s, in particular then, of course, with John Maynard Keynes, a British mathematician who was advising the US President Franklin Roosevelt on how to overcome the economic crisis of 1928 and the following years, in seeing that this crisis would be a crisis of too little spending, and by increasing government spendings, overcoming this crisis. Unfortunately, most of the government spending was the Second World War then, and this is actually what ended the crisis. So although Keynes was probably right in his analysis, government spending and using taxpayers' money to do things is not always a good thing if you think of the mayhem and the disaster that created around the world, but certainly it ended the crisis. So let's see a few of the waves that at that time were discovered. So a lot was going on in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a technocratic system. People hoped to use science and central control to get economy running. In particular, the Soviet Union, I mean, Russia was a really poor country, but this thing was in disarray economically. And so there was a lot to do, and the idea was that the Soviet government would do that in a systematic and scientific way. And so there were a lot of mathematicians working at that time and discovering that there is these kind of cyclical, these wave-like movements. So the shortest is the so-called Kitchin cycle. Joseph Kitchin formulated that in the early 1920s, and he thinks that he thought that these 4-year cycles, basically up and down swings of the economy, come basically from, I mean, they're a bit like a traffic jam on the motorway, where people drive too closely to the cars in front of them, and if there's only then a small slowing down at one point, for example, kind of a gust of wind makes people brake, or a truck is in the way and people have to slow down a bit, then the cars pile up and a wave builds backwards and everything comes to a halt. So this is how most of traffic jams actually happen. So it's just people not keeping their distance, otherwise traffic would just flow. And the idea of kitchen is a bit similar to that. It is that people kind of follow leaders and follow rumors or so and invest their money, and somehow that leads to irrational allocations of money on the stock markets, and then that goes wrong. I mean, the technology is not yet there, or the companies are not ready actually to deliver, and so you have this kind of 4 years of ups and downs of the economy. So that's the kitchen cycle. The Juglar cycle is the next. It's a bit longer running, and here it's basically a function of depreciation and amortization. So it is similar to the kitchen cycle. The kitchen cycle is cash flow, basically. It's what the companies or rich investors or so spend, or banks or whatever, going out and in like traffic. The Juglar cycle is real estate and expensive machinery, because that's the average depreciation or amortization time. For example, if you buy a heavy truck, the amortization, I think, is 12 years usually in the West. I mean, here in the Emirates, I mean, of course, taxes are a totally different beast. But in most countries, people, in particular corporations, pay taxes only for the amount of money that they earn after all their costs are deducted. And machinery that you buy that lasts for more than a year usually can be amortized over many years. So that means that you can't write off the whole costs of the machine in the first year. You have to spread that, pace that out over whatever many years the machine is expected to work for you. And the same is for real estate, where the cycle is usually 30 years even. So this is the Juglar cycle, so that's basically fixed investments over 10 years. Every investment gets liquid, so to say. I mean, even if you think of real estate as being a fixed investment, you pay the money and then you sit there with your real estate. Or a big truck, I mean, you buy it and then it's there, and you have to do whatever you thought doing is it to pay off your debt. But over the course of 10 years, of course, you can sell out the things. I mean, you can sell your real estate, you can sell the car. And so nothing is fixed in the long run. And so you have these waves, it's just slower than the kitchen cycle. And then we have the Kuznets cycle. So Kuznets is another Russian mathematician, and he notices that people, like in these generational dimensions, move. So, for example, people in Russia, there were a lot of people in St. Petersburg, which then became Leningrad. Since that was no longer the capital, because the new government moved the capital back to Moscow, a lot of people moved back to Moscow too. And these things don't happen overnight. I mean, if you look in Germany, for example, so Western Germany had the capital Bonn, a small town on the Rhine River, after the war, because Berlin was in the east. East Berlin was the capital of the German Democratic Republic, the Soviet-occupied part of Germany, and the other part of Berlin was occupied by the Allies, that is the Americans, the British, and the French. So Germany didn't own Berlin legally, so to say. But after the reunification and the peace treaty finally in 1992, the capital from Germany was moved to Berlin. And all the civil servants that used to live in Bonn had basically to move, but everyone knows that that is not possible. So there was a 20-year plan to move them from Bonn to Berlin. That is finally over now, and basically most of the government people actually live in Berlin. So this is why it is 20 years. And then finally we have the most long-running cycle, the Kondratiev cycle. So Nikolai Dmitrievich Kondratiev was a mathematician noticing development of technology over a very long time span. I mean, he really went back all into the medieval times and so on. And although his papers that he published in German were not explicitly stating these waves, it was Josef Schumpeter, a liberal economist of the 1930s, who discovered Kondratiev's work and named these cycles in his honor. So Kondratiev was killed by order of Joseph Stalin in 1938, being in the way of Stalin, as so many intelligent people in the Soviet Union were. And but his name survived with this discovery. And if you look at it, so he has these long waves of development that go up and down and up and down. Always when like at the E, so in the improvement phase, a new technology is invented, so at D or E, wherever. So, for example, the steam engine is invented, and the steam engine causes a huge change in people's lives. I mean, the largest probably that ever happened since the end of the Ice Age, or the discovery of fire for people's use. And it's really, you can't overestimate the role of the steam engine in how it changed the world. And then, I mean, the interesting thing that happened with the steam engine after people used it in their factories is that people thought, well, actually, we can drive railroads with it. So that was a deliberate action. So the railroad, that was not just an invention that some guy in their garage made. It was the British government giving a prize to people coming up with working steam engines on wheels. And this led to the development of capable railroad engines. And then so railroad, until the late 19th century, was a huge thing, in particular, of course, in North America, where it coincided with pushing the frontier to the West Coast. And then in the end, led to the transcontinental railways through the United States, but also through the Russian Empire, I mean, with the Trans-Siberian Railroad. So these enormous engineering tasks that consumed enormous amount of steel. And to fulfill that, everywhere in the world, huge steel plants were built. So while at the beginning of the 19th century, you didn't need much steel. I mean, you would have your shovels and maybe your pots and pans made from steel. But by the mid-19th century, steel was a major commodity. You needed it for everything. Everything was made out of steel because that became so cheap, because there was such a need for the rails in particular, but also for the boilers of the steam engines. So that's the railway story. Enormous amounts of money flow into the rails. And a lot of money was lost because it was not that profitable in the end. And then comes the next wave with the electrical revolution and the chemical revolution. This is also very interesting because both these developments were led by Germany, who was definitely not leading the steam and steel thing. So Germany in the 19th century was kind of backwards, but in the 20th century, around World War I, Germany became the leading economy in the world with, in particular, the invention of the electric motor by Werner von Siemens and by industrial chemistry becoming a thing. And then, I mean, that went down, as we all know, and then comes the automobile, which was not a German thing anymore. The automobile is the story of success in the United States, with Henry Ford inventing the conveyor belt, using enormous exploitation of his workforce to produce cheap cars. But on the other hand, that drove workers' rights movement, the workers of the world's, the international union movement. So by the 1920s already, most of American work was unionized, and so prosperity broadly started to rise again until basically the 1970s, when that turned. So that's the automobiles, the oil industry, of course, and then comes the fifth wave that started after Second World War, which is computers. And I guess we can safely say that by 2026, our 5-year window in the future, the computer revolution will be thoroughly over. I mean, everyone has one. I mean, that doesn't mean the computers stop working. I mean, this is not the case at all, but it means that there will be no growth anymore. And so the question would now be, since the fifth wave might have peaked between 2000 and 2010, that is the prediction, what comes next? What would be the sixth Kondratiev wave? That would have its peak around 2030. Yeah, what might that be? Just suggest things. What I want to show you is that waves actually are just a way of envisioning a circular movement. So this is just a demo I have from my Decoding Nature class that I also teach. So you see this circular movement that's actually the velocity and location of a spring going up and down, and how that creates sine and cosine waves. If you think of the circle going around and you have a piece of paper and pull it through and think of a Feldpen moving with the circle. So we have a cycle actually when we see waves. And so let's think of this cyclical world view. I think there is many cultures in the world who don't have this strong belief in linear progression, like the Judeo-Christian Islamic view on the world is. So that means that yesterday is over and tomorrow is kind of following in kind of an independent, progressive way. So even if you think that progress doesn't necessarily make things better, that things decay or whatever, you think of time as being linear. There is probably many cultures that have a much more cyclical understanding of time. And however, I don't know these cultures very well, so I have to tell you the things that I know. And one of the authors that I particularly like is Gian Battista Vico. Now that I'm back in Abu Dhabi and have my books, this is indeed one of the philosophy books that I enjoyed reading the most, because it is written in beautiful language and it's very poetic. So Vico was a law professor in Naples in southern Italy. At the time when he lived in the mid-18th century, was one of the richest cities in the world. It was the capital cities of the Kingdom of Sicily. So it was totally splendid. So Vico enjoyed that, and then started to think what is the philosophical background of his law, his law practice, and came to the idea that there is something in law that has to do with history, because law is kind of codifying what people in the past were thinking is right or wrong. So it is worthwhile to look into the past to understand how people come to the idea what is right. And so one of the first things that he saw is that you cannot come up with things that are against reality. So this is just the thinking of world building in our future punk way. The order of ideas has to follow the facts. And please keep that in mind. So even if we speak of time now, there will be no time travel. That is not a good story. Of course, you can make fun stories out of time travel. You can come up with very entertaining stories. But if you want to tell a story that people find meaningful as something that actually could happen, then time travel, for example, is not great. One of the things at the time of Vico's life was the excavation of many Roman ruins. I mean, of course, people knew these Roman ruins. So this is, for example, the big theater arena in Verona in northern Italy. So, I mean, it is just so huge. There's so much stone that you can't just ignore it. So people always knew that at the time, before they lived, people had huge theaters. And people, of course, were wondering, I mean, what culture was there that could afford a theater so big, so grandiose? And Vico looked at these ruins, in particular near his hometown, where the ruins of Pompeii were excavated. Pompeii, a very nice little Roman provincial city, also quite rich, that got wiped out by the eruption of the volcano Vesuvius, which is directly next to Naples, in the year 79 of the Common Era. So at Vico's life, people started to discover how sophisticated and how different also the Roman culture and civilization was. And at the same time, another excavation took place, which was the palace of Knossos in Crete, in Greece. So that was discovered at the same time, so that people rediscovered that there was this much older than the Roman times. I mean, really millennia older. These ruins that would show wealth in Crete at that time that was unimaginable. I mean, this is one of the largest palaces in the world. It's beautifully decorated. And people started to understand that, for example, the story of the Minotaur, this half human, half bull, a monster that was sitting in a labyrinth put there by King Minos, and demanding the sacrifice of a young woman every year, that this labyrinth actually might be this palace in Knossos because it's totally labyrinthic. So these things were discovered at Vico's lifetime, and so he looked at that and said, how can it be that things at that time were so great, and in such a long time things were not great at all? And things were so raw and brutal. And now, if you look at the background of Verona, now things become nice again in the Baroque and Rococo age, in the times of like 1700 to 1800. But it took really a long time. And so Vico thinks that there must be something going on that's going kind of back and forth in like a wave. And what Vico says, it's not a wave, it's a cycle. That means that there's people starting to look for the necessary. They are very raw. And then they start discovering things that are not only covering their basic needs, but that are actually useful, like tools, and so they make their life easier, and then they become strict. I come to what that means in a second. And then after covering the necessities and the daily usefulness, they notice convenient things and start having comfortable things and become tender. This is the peak of culture, so to say, when people start enjoying things. But then they indulge in luxury and fall for lavish waste. And then they lose all their wealth and fall down. And this means they become dissipated and so on. So this is the idea that he follows in his book, The Principles of a New Science, Principi de Scientia Nova, from 1744. So this is a depiction that comes from where I grew up. It's a manuscript from around 1,000 years ago, maybe a bit more, like 950 or so. It was painted in southern Germany and written in southern Germany and collected in the library of one of the monasteries in southern Bavaria, close to where I grew up, in Benediktbeuren, so Buranum in Latin. And it is a very famous collection of poetry, this book, made famous by the composer Karl Orff, Carmina Burana. Maybe you know Carmina Burana. It's a choral and orchestra work of the mid-20th century. So, and if we look at this wheel of fortune, that is a bit exactly kind of this going up and down in cycles, as Vico describes it 500 or 600 years later. So, going up is the corso, that means the path, the way. And going down is the ricorso, that means coming back. So that's, and it starts, if you look at what we have from ancient cultures, this is all Vico, I mean, I'm just rephrasing what he writes in his book. We start with the age of gods. People are superstitious. They believe everything is kind of animated. Every tree contains a spirit and so on. Until that is taken over by kind of the same thinking, but now connected to heroic people. And so the age of gods, thinking of the Greek or Roman gods, there's so plenty that are, for example, the planets moving on the sky. We shift towards these superhuman heroes like Odysseus, Ulysses, or Achilles, Agamemnon, and all these heroes of the Greek mythology. And finally, we come to what we understand really as history. That is the age of people. So where we know people like Cicero, or in Greece, people like Demosthenes or so, where we know of politicians and people doing things like philosophers and people writing literature and making art also, and we know their names. So it's the age of people. And then comes finally the decay, which is the age of evil leaders like Julius Caesar, who seize power and then kind of drive everything into the ground with their corruption. And Vico is not so much criticizing that. He's basically just laying it out as a matter of fact. I mean, this is just how it is. Look into history and you see that over and over and over again. However, he says there is interesting indicators what happens at the same time in the arts. And that is, I think, very beautiful and very poetic. And you might think of using these tropes, these rhetoric figures, these figures of speech that Vico ties into each age for coming up with your own stories. So with the age of God, we have the metaphor. Everything is metaphorical. Everything has a second meaning. You know, the sun is not just the sun, it is the god Helios. A river has a spirit, but also every color, every thought that you have has different layers of metaphorical meaning. The most elaborate of metaphors is the allegory, where you see something and it means something totally different, and by that creates a very rich form of meaning. So that is the trope of the age of the gods. With the age of heroes, we have the metonymy. So the metonymy is if you speak of one thing meaning a total. For example, you say, as was announced by Washington yesterday. Of course, you don't mean Washington, you mean the US government or the US president. So, but you say it's Washington. Or you say, the Gulf faced its worst economic crisis in 2008. And of course, the Gulf doesn't face any crisis. It's just it's water. Of course, you mean the economies around the Gulf. So this is metonymy. You say something that is really very closely related, and it's not metaphorical, but it is one thing standing for another. So that is the age of heroes. You use these. You always speak of nations, for example, if you actually mean the people living there, and so on. So this is metonymical. And the age of people, interesting, he sees an irony. And if you think of social media, of all the way you see communication these days, I might say that is pretty accurate. So we see a lot of irony. Irony is really strong. If you would have looked back 100 or 150 years, most of the world's population would never have encountered any irony. Irony is really a very rare way of expressing things because it's actually pretty weird. You say something and mean the opposite. Yeah, great that that happened today. I mean, of course, you mean it is not great. This is irony. So irony. And then you have the evil leaders falling back into the metonymy until you end up in your magical thinking at the age of gods. And in a way, you can even think of this cycle as the cycle of life also. I mean, as a child, I mean, everything is enchanted, and everything has a second meaning because you don't understand, or you have no way of knowing how things are. And then as a school child and teenager, you start understanding more and see kind of singled out people. I mean, maybe follow people that you find important or meaningful, and so on. And then as an adult, you start becoming hard and ironic and understanding on the other hand. And then as a senile old person, you start sliding back. So it is also your own biography that is a bit like how the world is. All these models, I have to say, are of course only allegories. I mean, if you look out of the window, there is no Kondratiev waves. And of course, we don't know anything about these ages of heroes. It is poetic. It's a form of literature in telling stories. And this is why I have it here. It makes good stories. It makes things relatable and creates pictures in your head that make your story rich. Yeah, let's just see more cycles. One cycle that I used to use heavily in my life as an advertising person is the Strauss-Howey cycle. So the Strauss-Howey cycle was discovered or was first formulated in the 1970s. So Strauss and Howey wondered why the generation of the so-called baby boomers, so this is totally Western-centric, I mean, I have to say this is solely in Europe and particularly in the US, how this consecution of generations is. But I mean, I'm just telling you the story how it was decided, and then we can discuss how to make meaning of it in other cultures, in other parts of the world. So what Strauss and Howey discovered is, or what they were wondering is, why were the baby boomer generation, that means the generation that was basically born in or shortly after the Second World War, becoming so strictly adversarial to their parents and great-parents when they came of age? Because in 1968, all over Europe and in the US, but also in other places in the world, people started to uprise against conservative governments, and often against democratic conservative governments, and also against the conservative culture that would surround them. And so the question is, what creates this generation gap, as people at that time called it? Why would the baby boomers suddenly find it meaningful to smoke marijuana and live as hippies and give up their bourgeois lifestyle and listen to music that their parents found totally horrible, like the Beatles? I mean, even music that we now think of as totally mainstream was, of course, at that time scandalous. So what is the motor behind that? And so Strauss and Howey did a lot of empirical research and interviewing people with questionnaires and so, and came up with this model that there is these generations that basically like every 25 years or so, there's a new generation. I mean, a new generation of people grows up, and so in these waves of generations, you have some kind of cultural homogeneity. So people are of the same mindset. So, for example, my generation, Generation X, I mean, grew up after the boomer generation had their uprising. So there was nothing left to uprise for me, so to say. So my generation, kind of in the late 1980s or 1990s, they said, what shall we do actually? I mean, now the Soviet Union collapses, the Cold War is over, capitalism has won, there is hardly anything to do about it. In Russia, there's the organized crime took over with Boris Yeltsin as this kind of totally corrupt government. So everyone saw, okay, Cold War is over, but it's not that great either. In other places, however, I mean, many dictatorships crumbled, democracies prevailed, everything got slightly better, but not that great. And so it was kind of atomic threat was suddenly gone. I mean, the nuclear holocaust that everyone expected in the 70s or 80s to happen. I mean, when I grew up, I never was super afraid that they would just be incinerated any day, because everyone expected the nuclear war to start any day. And that didn't happen. And so when I became an adult, I mean, yeah, that was over. And climate crisis had not hit that much yet, and the internet just started. So it was kind of this, it was this generation of people enjoying the internet, but also not so much. So this is my generation, Generation X. The name Generation X was coined by Douglas Coupland. Douglas Coupland is a writer who I would say would in a very nice way bring all out of what is wrong in Silicon Valley, so to say, in his books. And Generation X is really the book of my generation. It's this guy dropping out of college and of his posh job. I think he's a photographer or something like that, and then moving from LA to Palm Springs, which is about like an hour or so east of Los Angeles. And this is, Palm Springs is a bit like if you imagine how Sadyat Island will look like when all the villas are built. So there's a lot of villas in Palm Springs and basically retired people living there and waiting to die. And what he does there is he's the pool cleaner for these rich people. And because what else should he do? And that is the story of Generation X. And then comes, and people are not very imaginative, then comes, of course, Generation Y, which are better called the millennials. It's people so many of you could be called the late millennials. So at the edge between the millennials and the post-millennials. That is people who basically grew up with the internet. And then we have the post-millennials, which is, I think, your generation in particular. And the question is what is defining, and here you have these categories that you would say that the boomers are kind of in this high mindset, this kind of drug high, but also kind of in this excited high in this, and Generation X is kind of they see things from a very distant point of view. They say, well, that was great, but now the intoxication has faded and I'm now sober again, and it's not that great. And then the millennials become nervous, and they're the woke generation. They are the new left in America, for example, people pushing the Democratic Party in the United States after the election in 2020, and so on. And then the post-millennial faced the crisis, as did the generation, the silent generation in the 1920s. They face that things don't go on as they used to be going on. So you could say this is also connected to these long-running waves, the Kondratiev waves, for example, that you say, and now the peak of the fifth Kondratiev is reached, and the sixth Kondratiev has not started yet. So this is what we face at the moment. So this is the Strauss-Howe cycle, and in terms of advertising, it's a totally brilliant model. It works so well. If you look into the preferences and the culture of each of these generations, and come up with your advertising or brand stories, that's perfect. And so why not use it for literature and telling your stories and building your characters that way as well. A much lighter note now is James Lever's law. So James Lever, about 100 years ago, was a curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. The Victoria and Albert Museum is the largest collection of everyday goods, you could say, and is a design and crafts museum. If you have not visited it, it's a strong recommendation. If you ever make it to London, go to the Victoria and Albert Museum. It's super interesting. And Lever was the curator for the textile collection. So he was overseeing the acquisition and categorization of all the fashion. And he would say, well, fashion is really interesting if you look into it. And if you think of things, I mean, coming back to our first lecture, Vivienne Westwood, I mean, of course, not born when Lever formulated that, but so punk. I mean, when it was conceived, and people were saying, oh God, that is outrageous, that is so indecent. And then more and more people start wearing it, and people would look away and say, it's shameless how these young people look these days. And then people start saying, well, actually, it's pretty cool. And then if you are on top of the curve at the current fashion, people say, oh, that's smart, smartly dressed. And then if fashion is over by a year or so, you say, well, yeah, that was last year's fashion, you know. And so on. And it becomes ridiculous at a point when you really look like someone, actually like your grandparents. And at one point people say, well, that's actually quaint. I mean, if you would dress like a person from the late 60s or 70s now, people would say, oh, that's quaint, you know, like the multicolored big ties and shirts with really big collars or so. So that's even thinking of the 1920s, Art Deco and fashion. It's charming. And then looking even further back, I mean, fashion of the late 19th century would maybe say, well, oh, that's romantic. And then you look even further back and see, for example, the splendid robes of kings and queens of the past times, and sultans and moguls. And you say, well, that is beautiful. There is so much craft in it. So this is Lever's law, and you can apply Lever's law for a lot of things. I can tell you, it's really great. It's great for storytelling and imagining how fashion will evolve. In the literature, you'll find this very interesting paper by Ton and others. About what people actually think of when they speak about future. And so basically, I mean, this is only in America, but you see already it's very consistent. So in average, people say the future is 15 years ahead. But if you look more closely, the median, which means most people, say 10 years. And however, if you look at the standard deviation, that's pretty wide. So there is some people who really think the future is much, much more, and other people think it's much, much less. And so women think a bit less far into the future. They're a bit more in the present, and men, you know, have the big thoughts, strategizing their male superiority into the future. And then you see that in the age of adulthood, you also tend to think a bit further out, probably because you think of retirement. But if you have reached retirement age or are close to it, then it doesn't matter that much anymore. So I mean, that's my interpretation of the numbers. And you see that there is significant differences in terms of religion. So Christian in America, of course, means mostly Protestant, is a very short outlook. It's very practical. While Judaism and the Asian religions, which I guess is mostly Chinese in this survey, is also much longer in the future. And so you see a very strong cultural relationship, but I mean, I would say, grosso modo, people are not really thinking very far ahead. And it's a pity if you think of things that run over a long time, like, for example, climate change. And an interesting guy is Stewart Brand. I mean, we will come to Stewart Brand in the next lecture again when we speak about kind of these next lecture we speak about messianic ideas. Stewart Brand came up with this idea of the long now, and he says there is not everything. I mean, if you look at society at a certain time, like now, you have things that are very short, like fashion. I mean, fashion is basically new every half year or even shorter nowadays. So fashion is really it goes very fast. And if you have watched Bruce Sterling's talk in the first, it's in the assignments of the first week, you know that Bruce Sterling says, well, and you have kind of these futurists of fashion. That is people, there's these top fashion designers who are actually always ahead of the curve, and you can really follow them. They're basically 1 year ahead of what people see as fashion. Because, I mean, of course, someone has to come up with the designs, and then the fashion has to be produced. So that takes a bit of time, but it doesn't take so much. With commerce, things run, I mean, as we have seen in these other waves, in these other cycles, a bit slower, and that is very simple. I mean, you have amortization and depreciation. So if you have an investment, for example, into a new technology, for example, you start building new hardware, or you work on a big software project or so, that takes several years to pay off. So you don't just hack together something and then you jump to the next thing. This is not how business works. You come up with something and then you sell it over many years, even if during that time you still improve it. This is how commerce works. So this is much slower. And then even slower is, and now comes an interesting thing, infrastructure or governance. So governance, I mean, if you think of the cycles of governments, so in most countries, governments change every once in a while. I mean, there is, of course, many governments where they don't change, like, for example, in the Emirates. But in many countries, I mean, there is kind of these governmental changes by elections or other means, could also be by coup d'etat or whatever. So, like, for example, the United States governments usually stay for 8 years and then they change. Or in Europe, that is also, I would say, a rule of thumb is that governments don't change that often. Like in Germany, Angela Merkel, for example, stayed like for 16 years or so, but not every chancellor has that luck. And the same is in the UK. In Italy, it's much shorter. I think the average Italian prime minister has an office time for like 2 years. So we have every 2 years a new government. The same is in Belgium or in the Netherlands and so on. But I mean, if you look at India, for example, another big Republican democracy, the Indian government is also very stable and stays the same over sometimes like a decade or two even. So government is actually pretty slow moving. However, infrastructure is even slower. I think of infrastructure, I mean, if you go through Europe, I mean, most of the infrastructure, in particular in Southern Europe, has been sitting there for like 2,000 years or so. It's just new layers built on top. And the same is, of course, true in Asia, I guess, for many places. Not everything is infrastructure just built, like in the Emirates, where the big boom starts in the 1970s with the oil. And so I think infrastructure is even slower. I mean, once you have built your road, you don't build a second one next to it and abandon the one. Or if you build an airport, I mean, that really stays for a while. So infrastructure is something that moves incredibly slow. And even slower does culture. It is very rarely the case, for example, that a country changes its language. And thinking of Kazakhstan changing the alphabet, that is a major step. I don't think that in my lifetime I've seen that happen anywhere in the world, that a country deliberately decides to change the alphabet in which they write. And so this is a spectacular news. So culture is very conservative, very slow. It sticks for many, many centuries, if not millennia. If you think, for example, of ancient Egypt, and you look at this kind of what stayed the same, like from the old empire to the last empires. I mean, there's so much that stayed basically the same. I mean, how the hieroglyphs evolved over time, but stayed so consistent. So you see that culture is very, very slow, and it is incredibly hard to change. You don't change that in 1 or 2 generations. It takes forever. And even slower does nature change. I mean, climate change seems very rapid, but we are still talking the course of many decades or centuries, and that is already the question, is that nature, because it's human-made. But if you think of mountains forming, or continents moving, or rivers changing their course, I mean, that is really very slow. And so depending on what story you tell, you have to make sense of these different speeds. So there is an atemporality here. There is things happening at the same time that don't mean the same thing. As Stewart Brand always say, so we have these short running cycles, and they drive change, like commerce, like business. And we have the slow moving cycles, like culture, that remember. And so Stewart Brand very much advocates for thinking of institutions that have these very long memories, like the world religions, where the scripture on which they rely and the liturgy, the basic cultural agreements on which they are built, last for many millennia often. So, and this is this categorization of Stewart Brand thinking of, if you think of now, I mean, psychologically, that what is the present is like 3 seconds in our mind, and then it's the next instant. But you can say, I mean, what's now, it's basically like what happens this week or something like that. And if you say nowadays, I mean, which is already quite old-fashioned, I would say, nowadays these young people use WhatsApp, don't they? Then you speak like in 5, 10, 15 years, something like that. That is the nowadays thing. People in my time used to use the telephone to make calls, you know. So this is this, it's very human-shaped, the nowadays thinking. This is like a generation or 2. And then we have the long now. And this is Stewart Brand arguing for, we have cycles of 10,000s of years. And if you go back 10,000 years, you have all of human history and prehistory in these 10,000 years. I mean, even if people made cave paintings 30, 40,000 years ago, we don't know anything about these people. And so, I mean, Stewart Brand at least says, well, let's just start with the end of the last ice age and see what happened after that, when people built villages and cities and started to invent the alphabet and writing, and then technology and big buildings that we still find, and finally the civilization that we live in today, and then extrapolate that on the other side and see what the next 10,000 years bring. One of the things in the long now that has been made popular over the last 20 or so years by many scholars like Bruno Latour is the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is thought of as a geological age that is no longer being driven by movements in the earth, but by what people leave behind. Like, for example, the new islands that are built here, or all the trash that we pile up, and so on. And The idea of these crumbling civilizations and piling upon city upon city or so. I mean, you see that literally. If you go to cities in Europe, for example, and you see how deep under street level things from 2000 years ago are, you see that there is really a lot of debris that has been building up over the centuries. And these artifacts here, unfortunately, I don't know the artist, that was in an exhibition many years ago in the Deutsche Museum in Munich. Someone envisioned from this post-Anthropocene time, when people, I mean, like in the post-apocalyptic world, there's these people who make their artifacts from the big garbage patch, which is this huge island, or basically it's a continent-sized patch, a raft of plastic that is drifting through the Pacific. And with all the plastic, I mean, people then use the plastic to make the things of their daily use. Yeah, atemporality is really an interesting concept. So you see things that happen at different speeds. So I showed you in one of the last videos these nice pictures of Greenwich looking towards the city of London, the Isle of Dogs, where Canary Wharf and all these shiny skyscrapers were built over the last 30 or so years. But of course, not everything changed. I mean, if you look at the park and the hill on which the Greenwich Observatory has been sitting for the last 400 years, almost totally unchanged, you see that things run at different paces. And what is atemporality? For example, if you access music on Spotify or YouTube, you have all the music basically at hands. If you, like 30, 40 years ago, would have to switch on the radio to listen to music, you would only have what the radio would play at the moment. And then, of course, if you buy a record, you would have your record, your recorded music, but that was very limited. But now whatever you want is there. So when you want to play, for example, a piano piece, you can not only choose the piece that you want to play, you can also choose to who played it in the past and listen to them and try to play in their way and kind of collage all these different styles together. So this, of course, is very interesting. So we have a great mixture of the past all at hands now, and that is new. That came with the internet. We have like a big library at hands for almost everyone to kind of collage together. And with this, I mean, thinking of this metaphor of standing on the shoulders of giants, the giants is all what was created before. It is, of course, very hard to think of making any progress anymore. It's much easier to think of rearranging things that were already made. And that, of course, leads to totally different styles of music, like, for example, DJ music, where you use recordings and collage them together in samples. And a lot of contemporary music, of course, works that way. So this is atemporality. That is a very strong cultural change, I would say, over the last 50 years that happened, that is super interesting in thinking about the future. And it goes on. I mean, so if you look at this engraving from the time when the observatory was still state-of-the-art in the mid-19th century, you look towards London and it is already there. A lot is already there, but a lot has changed also. So you see the atemporality goes really far back. Yeah, that is, of course, very different in places. So this is Sheikh Zayed Road, a picture that I made in a museum in Dubai. So the road is already there, I mean the desert is there, and a few of the developments in in Jumeirah already start, but basically it's only the road that was built. And everything else, I mean, what Dubai is today has to be imagined. And things don't only go in one direction. So this is my hometown Munich, that's Marienplatz, the center square in front of the city hall. And the picture above is around when I was born. So when I was born, this is how it looked. So it was basically, it was quite hit by the war, and so you would look in the direction here in the direction towards southeast, and if you look in the picture down, that is about 10 years old, you see that there's a piece of architecture missing in the above picture, which is this tower. There's this tower with the red roof and kind of this pointy kind of small roofs. And although this tower looks totally medieval, it was built in my lifetime. So many years before the war, I mean, I forgot when, like in the 19th century, this tower was demolished. And in the 1970s, people thought, actually, why not build it again? Since we have a pedestrian zone now, we don't need the cars to go that gap. Let's just build a medieval tower. So we have the atemporality, not only combining things kind of forward-looking, but also, I mean, really restoring things that were long gone. And just pointing out things in the really far future. So this is a great paper that just recently came out. Kind of the estimate now that we know, or we think we know, how many planets might actually be orbiting around stars in our Milky Way galaxy. We can estimate what we expect in other civilizations live there. And then we can estimate, I mean, how many of these civilizations might have been faded out. And it's pretty depressing to think that the whole galaxy is probably filled with dead civilizations' remains. And that makes a great story, I would say. And because if you ever read the books Altered Carbon by Robert K. Morgan, this is the trick that Robert K. Morgan does. So in Robert K. Morgan's books, people have really advanced technology to change bodies. And of course, he knows that that will never be developed in any kind of meaningful future on Earth. But his idea is that on Mars, people find the remains of one of these ancient civilizations that didn't come from Mars, but just traveled there and had an outpost there, maybe 50 or 100,000 years ago, and then died out. And from that civilization, people kind of salvage this technology that then makes a great science fiction story. So all three books of the Altered Carbon series are really great books. I think the first two books have been turned into a television series on Netflix, which is a very violent television series, so viewer discretion be advised. The books are also pretty violent, but they are very beautifully written. Slow is really a thing that goes kind of complementary with the long now. So more than 10 years back, two friends and collaborators in research of mine, together with me, were writing this slow media manifesto, where we advocate for these slow things. Not that things actually, you know, like slow food. Slow food is where you cook things very thoughtfully, and you choose your ingredients in a very thoughtful way and take time in preparation. I mean, of course, you don't cook your pasta longer. It takes 4 or 5 minutes to cook the pasta. I mean, it doesn't get any better if you leave it longer in the water. It just gets mushy. But it means that you take more time in enjoying the cooking and preparing things, and then also take more time in eating it and enjoying the tastes. And the same you could do for anything. And think of science fiction being a bit more slow sometimes would tell maybe better stories. And I mean, thinking of time and these long movements, this is an interesting anecdote. So this is the astronomical clock in the Basilica Mariacka, the St. Mary's Cathedral in Gdansk in Pomerania in Poland on the Baltic Sea. So this was built in the late 15th century, around 1470, by the Nuremberg, which is in southern Germany, clockmaker Hans Dürninger. And unfortunately, it was hardly finished when the Lutheran Reformation struck and the Catholic Church fell apart, and Gdansk turned Lutheran, and the church was no longer Catholic, and the Lutherans really hated this clock. That was only 30 years later when they kind of said, well, this is kind of this papal luxury, who needs that? And the clock was no longer serviced. And then the final blow that hit the clock was in 1582, when the Gregorian calendar was introduced. So people saw that the old calendar that was in place since the old Roman times, this is why it's called the Julian calendar, because it was introduced under the government of Julius Caesar more than 2,000 years ago. So in the 16th century, people knew that was already wrong. That something happened with the leap years or so and had to be adjusted. And with this adjustment, the clock stopped actually telling the proper dates. But nevertheless, looking at it, it is a splendid form of art. It is really a clock where you can indulge in time's passing. It has all these informations on which prayers to pray, which parts of the Bible to read at what time. Really over the course of the year and changing over the years, and has all the movements of the planets and so on. So I think this is a very nice metaphor of a clock for the long now, which is actually the project by Stuart Brand in his Long Now Foundation. So he starts to collect with other people, starts collecting money to have a clock that would run for 10,000 years without being wound up. That is very ambitious. No technology ever invented would run for 10,000 years. Not even the really old technology that we see, for example. I need to think of what is the oldest technology that we see running in the world. That's probably things like the Phalanges in Al Ain, the irrigation system that brings water to the date palms. This is among the oldest technology that is in use still, maybe 3,000-4,000 years of use. And so building a clock that would 3 times as long lasting is really an ambitious goal, and I really like it. It's totally whimsical also. It costs a lot of money, and so he collects the money from many donors, and a lot of intellectuals and Silicon Valley people also are invested into the long now. So this was my course through time with you, and we will continue looking into tools to make nice futures in the next lecture, which will look into Marshall McLuhan's tetrad model and other ecological approaches to futures.